When I was 14 years old, my parents allowed me to attend my very first high school football game. I was over the moon with excitement, probably more over the moon than your average American teenager, because up to that point, I had lived a very sheltered childhood. I begged and begged my parents to allow me to go to the high school football game with some friends, unchaperoned by them, just for a few hours. They finally relented after weeks and weeks of begging, and so there I was, off with my friends to attend a very typical American pastime. But imagine my surprise when I came home that night to find that my parents were in a full-blown panic attack. I had come home an hour later than I had promised, and I found my parents visibly shaken because I had not told them that I would be late. My father was very pale and he'd gotten sick in the bathroom. My mother ended up calling everyone she knew to trace my whereabouts. Couldn't find where I was. I was just with some friends. We decided to go to one of their houses after the football game to listen to music. And I was so excited about my newfound freedom that I'd forgotten to call my parents to let them know I'd be late. This was in the 80s, before cell phones. And even if I didn't have a cell phone, I could have called on my friend's house phone, but I just didn't think about it. I was so excited for this independence to finally come. So I felt incredibly guilty to find my parents in full-blown panic attacks. They were your stereotypical, strict immigrant Filipino family, very Catholic. I was always a good student, came straight home from school, did my homework, never rebelled. And yet, here I was, breaking all sorts of rules that they, put in place for me, and I felt so guilty. Because aside from the stereotypical strictness of, this Asian American family, there was another layer to our lives that not a whole lot of people knew about, which was my grandmother who lived with us and who was my primary caregiver since I was an infant. She was an undocumented immigrant. She came from the Philippines, flew to the United States in 1972, left the Philippines the day that President Marcos had declared martial law on the country. And so she couldn't return, it was too dangerous. And so she had overstayed her tourist visa and lived in our household for the rest of her life as an undocumented immigrant. When you have an undocumented family member, no one really understands that everybody else in the family, everyone else in the household live as if they are undocumented themselves. So even though I was born and raised in the United States, I always lived with a fear of anxiety that somehow our lives could be changed overnight. If somehow someone found out that my grandmother, my primary caregiver, the first person who I spoke my first words to, the first person who saw me take my first steps, she could be very easily taken away. When you live in an undocumented household, you're constantly in a state of fear. And so that was what our household was like. We kept the front curtains closed all the time. I was never allowed to answer the telephone. I was never allowed to answer the door if someone knocked on it unexpectedly. I was never allowed to share personal information for myself, and I was never allowed to do any kind of extracurricular activities. I never learned how to swim. It took me a long time before I was allowed to learn how to ride a bike. We kind of lived this life as if we were Anne Frank, very quiet, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. And so, what do you do when you live this kind of life? Well, I grew up on a steady diet of television, just non-stop. I grew up on Love Boat reruns, Mary Tyler Moore, game shows like Sale of the Century, Price is Right, General Hospital, and The Bold and the Beautiful. I read everything I could get my hands on, so we would go to the school library and I'd get my one book every week, but we didn't have a public library card. We were too afraid to apply for one, and so I just basically read everything I could get my hands on. If I was done with my library books, I read the encyclopedia, which we owned A to Z, every single volume. I read the yellow pages, back to front. I grew up on JCPenney catalogs and memorizing all the different sections of the JCPenney catalog. I read Catholic Digest because my mother felt that Reader's Digest was not wholesome enough. So, reading just back issues of old Catholic digests. And during my childhood, during that very sequestered childhood, I lived entire fantasy worlds for myself, but I also became a mini anthropologist. I wanted to know what the world was like outside my door. I wanted to know what the people were like who got to live as Americans without having to fear that somebody would be taken away from them. I wanted to know American customs and cultures and practices based on what I had seen on television, what I'd read in books. And so that was much of my childhood. But as I stood there in front of my parents, being disciplined by them on that night that I came home late from the football game, something in me just felt like it needed to change. By then, Ronald Reagan had called for amnesty for undocumented immigrants. And so there was a pathway for us to apply for legal residency for my grandmother. And I knew that. And so something in me just finally decided to rebel. My first and only act of rebellion, I told my parents, look, you have sheltered me my entire childhood. I think it's time for you to let me go. You have sheltered me to the point that I don't know what the world is like out there. You've sheltered me because you were afraid something bad would happen to me. But you know what? If you shelter me so that nothing bad would happen to me, nothing good would happen to me either. Nothing will happen to me. And so I have to thank my parents for listening to me at that time, because something in them changed as well. I think they realized that they had denied me a typical American childhood for a long time, and they needed to learn how to trust me and to trust themselves. So they finally did let me go back out there into the world and experience high school football games, and I got to take extracurricular activities. I got to learn how to ride a bike. And here I am, 30 years later, and I have been able to travel the world. I ended up going on to college. I got my PhD, and I became an anthropologist. I have lived and conducted research all over the world. I've lived in Indonesia, I've lived in Germany, I've traveled to Uzbekistan, to Bosnia, to Turkey, all over Europe and Central America. But I remember my parents' words to me, which was, wherever you go, you need to call us to let us know that you're okay. And so everywhere I've traveled, everywhere I've done my research, I've always managed to find a telephone to call my parents and to let them know that I'm okay. Thanks.